let's get right back into this. You were talking about the Industrial Revolution, and that leads me into another aha moment. And as I mentioned before, there were many of them in the book, but this is really interesting to me. You have a piece in the book on why women really did not want to vote, and I think that is so incredibly insightful. Women didn't want to vote, and there were really good reasons for that, because it took the impetus of the man and directed it wrongly.
Yes. So when I mentioned that the book was attacked by Christian egalitarians, this was one section that they hated and that they attacked me for. But what I was using the vote as an illustration of a change in political philosophy. I was really using it just as an illustration. So America started out with the dominant political philosophy was something called classical republicanism, which has nothing to do with Democrats and Republicans. It was adopted from the ancient Greeks and Romans. And what it was is an understanding of social institutions like the family or marriage or church as an organic structure with a common good. In other words, it wasn't just individuals coming together with their own idea of what was good, but that there was a common good for the marriage, for the family, for the church, for the school, and so on. And the person in authority, back to that, was the one in charge of the common good, responsible for making sure that the interest of the whole were being met, not just the individuals in it. But what about the interest of the whole? And then roughly after the Revolutionary War, about that time, America began to shift to what was called social contract theory. In social contract theory, there is no common good. Social institutions are pictured as so many individuals coming together because they all have the same common interest. In other words, we have marriage, for example, since we're talking about men and women in particular. Marriage was no longer seen as an organic unity with a common good, but two individuals just coming together because they shared some common interest. Well, social contract theory was implied that there is no higher good pulling us together in a marriage or a family, but merely that we share some common interests. And if we no longer share those interests, well, that's okay. We can break up then. And the example I gave was how this affected the debate over the vote. There were a lot of women who were opposed to the vote. In fact, I had so many people skeptical of this that I found quotes from the leading suffragists, the feminists of their day, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others, who said the main opposition to female suffrage is women. So they themselves acknowledged that women were the main opponents of female suffrage. And then I have quotes from those women who were against female suffrage. Why? Their answer was that they did not think of it as men's vote versus women's vote. They thought of it as household vote versus individual vote. And they wanted to retain that organic view of society where the household had a common good and that the man was responsible for that common good, as opposed to each one of us relates, individually to the state. As there's nobody between me and the state. It's just me, and the individual has no protective barrier between the individual and the state. And the reason that the anti-suffragists were concerned about that was because it reduced the responsibility that society was placing on men. They saw it as a decrease of male responsibility. If men voted as individuals as opposed to the head of a household, then he was no longer being held responsible for the common good of the household. So it was letting men off the hook. It was reducing their responsibility. That's how they saw it. Now, of course, eventually women came to support female suffrage, and there were two reasons for that. One was, as soon as there was universal male suffrage, well, then the meaning of the vote had changed. If men who were not head of a household could vote, then obviously the vote no longer meant the good of the household. I represent the good of the household. Now the vote meant an individual man. And if the vote meant an individual, then women quite logically concluded that they'd better represent themselves too as individuals. And the second reason was that women began to portray the vote as a way to protect the family. The women's Christian temperance movement, which was the largest women's movement ever in American history, so we're not talking about something small, began to portray the vote as a way to get women's voice into the public realm. And of course, they thought women were more loving and kind and compassionate and considerate, and it would bring a kinder voice, a kinder, gentler voice into the public arena. And she argued especially that women who had drunken husbands, who were spending their money at bars on alcohol instead of bringing money home to support their wives and children, and then because they were drunk, they were coming home and beating their wives. They said, how do these women have any voice? How do they have any way to protect themselves? And so the women's Christian temperance movement started to portray the vote as an opportunity for women to fight alcoholism. And so it took on overtones of protecting the home. In fact, she called it, the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Frances Willard, she called the vote the home protection ballot, home protection ballot. And so that got a lot of women finally in favor of the vote. But I thought it was an interesting debate just because it showed how America shifted from an organic view of society that held men responsible for the common good to an individualistic view of society, which pretty much let men off the hook. It said, no, society is not going to hold you responsible for the common good of your marriage, your family, the church, wherever you hold authority.
Today, Hank is talking to best-selling author Nancy R. Pearcey. She's talking about her new book, The Toxic War in Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. And this is an essential book to equip all Christians to challenge politically correct ideology and bring an evidence-based message of healing into the public square. So get this book very easily. Just click that I in the upper right-hand corner. You will see a link for the book right below the description of this video. There's a trending hashtag on social media, and it says, #KillAllMen. So how did an ideology arise that condemns masculinity as dangerous and destructive? Of course, we often hear that exhibit A of toxic behavior is evangelical Christian men. But the social sciences tell a very different story. Studies find that men who attend church regularly test out as the most loving husbands and the most engaged fathers. And Nancy goes through all these sociological facts that basically explode the anti-male stereotypes, and particularly she shows that Christianity has the power to overcome actual toxic behavior and reconciles the sexes. So again, click that I in the upper right-hand corner for a link to this book, and you'll find it below the video description. Now back to the conversation with Hank and Nancy.
You do the most delicious job of turning the tables so often in this debate. I just love it. In terms of letting men off the hook, so you're sort of taming men, you're elevating women, but the turning of the tables is this lets men off the hook, and this became part of the reform movements in general. The novels themselves let men off the hook because it was demonizing men, and therefore men were, they were simply let off the hook in terms of their responsibility. This is just part of your personality. This is part of your nature. Therefore, you can't be held responsible for it.
Right. So there was a huge mushrooming of reform movements in the 19th century. We talked about the Industrial Revolution. Men's behavior was growing worse. As I said, society was secularizing. Men were not attending church as often. They were not feeling as bound by Christian moral ethic. And so there was a great increase in drinking, gambling, fighting, crime, prostitution, sometimes a single fact can kind of crystallize it for you. In 1830, Americans drank more, 3 times as much as Americans drink today. So there was a reason there was a temperance movement. There were movements, well, there was the abolition movement against slavery, of course. There were movements against prostitution and sex trafficking. There were movements to help orphans. There were a host of movements. In fact, historians refer to this network of movements collectively as the benevolent empire. And most of them were won by women, because now that women, as I said earlier, had been made the moral guardians of society, they said, well, we've got to go out in public and solve these moral issues. Well, the trouble, of course, is that most of these movements, reform movements, were aimed at what were traditionally male vices, like drinking. Well, let me give a quote. So this is one of my favorite feminist quotes. Feminist historian says, there was little doubt as to the sex of the tavern keepers, the slaveholders, the drunkards, and the seducers. And so there was a tone, there was a sexual antagonism happening with these moral reforms as well. And unfortunately, what it meant is more and more society was just accepting that men were naturally lewd, rude, and crude, and that it was up to women to tame them. And so this double standard, well, I think it's still happening today. I was interviewed not long ago on a podcast with a young couple. And so this was my chance to find out how they thought, was the double standard still evident in the Christian church? And they said, oh, absolutely. In the dating scene, for example, they said, it is just expected that boys are always going to push the envelope on sexually, that boys are going to be more prone to porn and other, sin and vice, and that it's up to women to be the gatekeepers, to hold the line, to make sure that they don't violate the moral standards. They said very much that same double standard they think is still in the church today. But it's good to know where it came from. It starts back with the Industrial Revolution, when men were no longer held responsible for their families in the same way.
And we're let off the hook. One of the points you make in this book as well that, I'm just calling these aha moments because there's so many of them. I'm thinking about them as we're going through this podcast. But in the ancient world, people recognized that the rejection of abortion was to be pro-woman. In the contemporary world, to oppose abortion is seen as being anti-woman. That is a disjuncture that many people do not know about.
Yes, today we don't realize that abortion is essentially saying that a woman should be more like a man. That in order to make it in society today, women have to deny that which characterizes them most as women. Of course, as human, we share a lot of things in common with men. But as women, what's distinctive about women is, of course, that we are the ones who bear children. And unfortunately, I think the message for a long time has been, if women want to make it, if they want to have an interesting professional life, if they want to develop their skills, they have to be more like men. And what does that mean? That means they have to control their fertility. They have to be able to determine when they're going to have children. And if the child comes at the wrong time, they have to have the right to abortion. And after their children are born, they have to have the right to daycare, preferably state-funded daycare, so that they could be just as available to the workplace as men are. So to me, that sounds like an obvious denigration of women, because it's saying you don't have value unless you can function essentially as a man. And abortion is one of the key tools for that. So, and it's true. I mean, let's face it, pregnancy coming at an awkward time can be very difficult. I was in seminary when I became pregnant with my first child. And I was in crisis about it, to tell you the truth, because I didn't know how to pursue my deepest interest except through the academic world. Those are my interests. And I thought, like, having to drop out of seminary felt like falling into a black hole. No, it turned out I loved being a mother. I homeschooled my kids. I wanted more time with my kids. And I've worked part-time from home most of my career. But I can understand why women sometimes do find it difficult to have to drop out of a job or drop out of work or fall into poverty because they had a child. So we want to be understanding about this. But ultimately, the message that you must be like a man, who should adapt? I say the workplace should adapt, not the woman. I say the education system should adapt. If women are the ones who have babies, we should adapt to that and not force them to feel like, well, the only way you can accommodate is to drop out or have an abortion. I mean, so many women feel that way. So all that to say, we should change our society to be welcoming to children instead of changing women's biological functions so that they fit better into a male world.
This is another, I didn't mean to get to this early, but that's another aha moment. You talk about the Industrial Revolution. It brought in, the reform movements in general brought so many problems to the table. And you say you can't really go back to the agrarian culture, but you can, because of technology, do things today that we weren't able to do, even in the agrarian culture. So you can bring men and women back into the home with equal responsibility in terms of rearing their children. So you can have a healthy family nucleus once again.
Yeah, I do think that the ideal is for both men and women to be able to do economically productive work while raising their children, which is what they did have prior to the Industrial Revolution. Since we've talked about feminism a bit, I mean, obviously one reason for the feminist movement is that when men left, when the Industrial Revolution took men's work out of the home, of course, it took women's work out of the home as well. You cannot be a Proverbs 31 woman in the same way, running all these businesses from home, or rather, that's been our assumption. I would like us to go back to saying, yes, you can. But I'll have a whole chapter on practical ways that we can maybe flex the workplace. People don't realize this, but surveys show that men report just as much work-family tension as women do. That many men do report feeling that constant grief, that they're not as involved with their children as they would like to be. And so the pandemic had a very slight silver lining, which is that a lot of fathers discovered they did like being home more and being closer to the children. 65% of American fathers in one survey said they did not want to go back to the office full time when the pandemic ends. And the New York Times had an article titled something like, "During the pandemic, fathers got closer to their children and they don't want to lose that." I love that. So in the book, I give a lot of anecdotes. That's about all you can do right now, is just here's anecdotes. Here's how various people have succeeded in creating a flexible workplace. One of my graduate students is married to an IT professional, and he came home during the pandemic. And because he was working from home, he was able to be more involved in their family's homeschooling. He decided he would be the one to make lunch every day. He was able to take his kids to soccer practice and choir practice. And he picked up so many of the family responsibilities that his wife was able to start a part-time business. She's an opera singer. I have a student who was an opera singer. And so she started a voice studio, and the whole family benefited from the additional income. So I interviewed her husband, and he said to me, "Our family is so much more balanced now. He said, I am never going back to a cubicle." And the final kicker is, he said, "The time I used to spend commuting to work, I now spend praying with my wife." And I thought, okay, this is a great example that you can help people. I have several more examples, mostly my students who found ways. But I also had to quote CEOs, right? Because we have to convince the workplace that this is good as well. And it was interesting. I found CEOs who said, we did not want to experiment with home-based work because we were afraid people were going to slough off and productivity would go down. And they said the pandemic has completely exploded that fear. We did not see a reduction in productivity. In fact, if anything, people work more when they work from home because they're not losing time commuting to work. They're not, wasting as much time in unnecessary meetings and so on. With people who work from home, you also almost have to tell them to stop, right? So we have to help people to understand that this is a win-win for both sides. It's a win-win for businesses as well as a win-win for families.
Today, Hank is talking to best-selling author Nancy R. Pearcey. She's talking about her new book, The Toxic War in Masculinity: How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. And this is an essential book to equip all Christians to challenge politically correct ideology and bring an evidence-based message of healing into the public square. So get this book very easily. Just click that I in the upper right-hand corner. You will see a link for the book right below the description of this video. You know, there's a trending hashtag on social media, and it says, #KillAllMen. So how did an ideology arise that condemns masculinity as dangerous and destructive? Of course, we often hear that Exhibit A of toxic behavior is evangelical Christian men. But the social sciences tell a very different story. Studies find that men who attend church regularly test out as the most loving husbands and the most engaged fathers. And Nancy goes through all these sociological facts that basically explode the anti-male stereotypes, and particularly she shows that Christianity has the power to overcome actual toxic behavior and reconciles the sexes. So again, click that I in the upper right-hand corner for a link to this book, and you'll find it below the video description. Now back to the conversation with Hank and Nancy.
You know, whenever I think of you, Nancy, I think of you sort of in harmony with Jay Richards, because both of you are masters at exploding mythology. So you take these myths and you explode them and you expose the utter bankruptcy of the mythology. I want you to take a moment to debunk the romantic movement and the myth of the noble savage.
Yeah, so the reason this is relevant is, again, the Industrial Revolution was such a turning point. As men were no longer growing up in the farms and living outdoors and being, hardy, strong farm boys, they were coming into the city and working in bureaucracies and working at desk jobs. People began to worry that men were becoming emasculated. They were becoming soft and effeminate. And there was actually a new word that entered the English vocabulary. The new word was over-civilized. Men were becoming over-civilized, and they needed to find a way to recover their manhood. Unfortunately, the answer that many of them gave was that they needed to get away from civilization, away from their wives and children, out into nature, go out and be a cowboy, roping cattle with the cowboys and sleeping under the stars, or frontier man, or a hunter, trapper, backwoodsman, and so on. And this was inspired partly by the romantic idea of the noble savage. The savage didn't have a negative connotation back then, by the way, but the noble savage who is somehow, because he's closer to nature, he's somehow more noble and more courageous than the poor civilized man in our Western society. And it was also driven, though, by Darwinism. You may have that question coming up, but I'm jumping ahead a little bit. But it was also influenced by the rise of Darwinian thought, because Darwinian thinkers said your true nature is you're an animal, right? You are basically a beast. The Darwinian thinkers began to argue that the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would by necessity be ruthless, rugged, savage, barbarian, and even predatory. And so the way to recover your true manhood was by leaving civilization behind again and by discovering the beast within. This is when the Tarzan stories became popular, for example. And the son of the author says they were explicitly written to give fictional form to the idea that men are just part of the animal world. That's all we are. And so Tarzan, of course, he retains that inner wildness, that inner courage, because he's been raised by the apes. And even after he learns European customs and languages, he turns to Jane and he says, "I'm still a wild beast at heart." And of course, there was a more serious literature too. There was a whole genre called literary naturalism, which also was giving fictional form to a Darwinian worldview. The best known is Jack London. And he was, as a young man, he read Darwinian literature. He read Darwin's writings so thoroughly that he could quote passages by heart. And one historian said he experienced a conversion experience, is what she called it, to radical materialism by reading Darwin. And so his books are mostly about dogs, but they're intended as metaphors, of course, for human beings. And his message is human beings are products of natural selection, genes and environment. They have no real free will. And so between the noble savage and Darwinism, the idea grew that to find your true manhood, you need to get away from civilization, away from the influence of marriage and family. And I think this is a highly destructive message because it's essentially telling men your true nature is not in marriage and family. It's getting away from that. That marriage, well, it's the Playboy message, right? Playboy specifically says your true self is not in marriage, but in your wild, free, adventuresome self. Then that marriage ties you down, and it's against your true nature. And so the way I counter that is with the cultural mandate. About half my class doesn't know what cultural mandate is, but it's in Genesis when God creates, he creates the universe, he creates the earth, he creates the trees and plants, he creates the animals, and then he finally creates the humans as the apex of his creation. And what's the first thing he says to them? The first thing he does is tell them why he created them. What's your purpose? Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. And in the streamlined language of Genesis, we can sort of unpack what that means. Be fruitful and multiply is not just your immediate family. Historically, all the social institutions grow out of the family. It becomes a clan, becomes a village, becomes a nation. And of course, social institutions are formed for certain functions like the marketplace, the school, the state, and then the treaties and constitutions that govern these groups. So the entire social world is what we're called to develop in Genesis. Subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. So, of course, historically, it usually starts with farming, but also mining, technology, inventing computers, composing music. One of my students said, "Oh, come on, composing music." So I played the violin and I said, "What's the violin made out of?" Wood. And what's the bow made out of? Horsehair. So all the transcendent beauty that you associate with music starts with harnessing the natural resources, in nature. So this was is often called the cultural mandate, because what it means is that humans were originally created to create cultures, to create civilizations, to make history. And this is before the fall. So after the fall, we fall. God has put us on a track. In sin, we fall off the track. In salvation, God puts us back on the track. But what was the track? You go back to before the fall, it's the cultural mandate. So men do not find their ultimate sense of masculinity by getting away from women and children and civilization. They find their ultimate fulfillment by rolling up their sleeves and digging deeply into their social responsibilities, starting with their family, and digging deeply into creative and productive work that serves other people.
This is I want to stay on the subject of Darwinism, but I want to ask you one sort of tangential question, and that is the Victorian Jesus, meek and mild. What does this have to do with the whole idea of toxic masculinity?
Yeah, so during the 19th century, a lot of Christians were becoming theologically liberal, meaning that they were starting to deny this supernatural element. The essence of liberalism is just to deny the supernatural. Jesus wasn't really divine, Son of God. He was a moral exemplar, right? Or they denied the Trinity, for example, and they denied the miracles that Jesus did. They denied anything that was supernatural. They denied that the Bible was divine revelation. No, the Bible was just the best religious insights over the generations. The people who wrote it, that was their insights. And so liberalism was getting rid of the content of Christianity, but they wanted to retain the feelings of religion because religion gave them nice emotional feelings, emotional experiences. The first liberal theologian was Schleiermacher in Germany, and he redefined religion as the feeling of dependence. There you go. So as a result, liberalism became very emotional and focused primarily on emotional engagement. Correct doctrine didn't really matter, but good feelings mattered. And so you can see why liberalism then led to a very pale and sentimental vision of Jesus. Jesus becomes this pale, sweet, like you said, meek and mild. In fact, that was a song that was common at the Victorian age. Jesus, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, look on me, a little child. It was a prayer taught to children. And so as a result, people began to feel that Christianity was emasculating, that Jesus himself was this almost effeminate character. And so there was a reaction against that. And I think a good reaction. I think it was an important course correction. Fundamentalism in the early 20th century stood against that, said, okay, we need to recover some sense of masculinity here. And Christianity, in opposition to liberalism, Christianity does care about correct doctrine. It does care about truth. And we need to be strong and bold in fighting for truth. And so the fundamentalists, in some ways, almost overcompensated because they began to say Christianity is a manly religion, and Christianity, the manliest man is the man in the pulpit, because he has to be able to fight against, heresy and liberalism. And so there was, and like I said, in many ways, it was a good course correction, because the fundamentalists said we want to have an alternative to that highly sentimental, almost effeminate style of liberalism. So I'm starting to wonder if I'm answering your question.
No, you are. You are. I mean, basically what I was driving at is, here you have Jesus is meek and mild, but as you point out, meekness is not about being soft. Meekness is power under control. So you have this kind of whipsaw because people didn't understand the biblical language. And so you get a completely different impression of Christianity, and certainly the Christ of Christianity.
That's good. Yeah, that's a good point. In my book, I do go to the word meek in the Greek. What did it mean in the first century? And it certainly didn't mean wimpy, or soft. Meek was used by Greek writers at the time. Xenophon, I think it was, who used it of a war horse that was well trained. That was what meek was. I mean, this is strength under control. Plato used it. Plato and Aristotle both used it as a general who is kind to a conquered people. If he's conquered the people, he has a right to just wipe them out. But no, he's kind to them. So that was the meaning. I pulled together some of those meanings that were from the first century to give us a notion of what the word meant back then. And you're right. Sort of the general meaning is not that you're weak. You're strong, but you know how to control it. You know how to do good. You know how to channel it to do good.
Today, Hank is talking to best-selling author Nancy R. Pearcey. She's talking about her new book, The Toxic War in Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. And this is an essential book to equip all Christians to challenge politically correct ideology and bring an evidence-based message of healing into the public square. So get this book very easily. Just click that I in the upper right-hand corner. You will see a link for the book right below the description of this video. There's a trending hashtag on social media, and it says, #KillAllMen. So how did an ideology arise that condemns masculinity as dangerous and destructive? Of course, we often hear that Exhibit A of toxic behavior is evangelical Christian men. But the social sciences tell a very different story. Studies find that men who attend church regularly test out as the most loving husbands and the most engaged fathers. And Nancy goes through all these sociological facts that basically explode the anti-male stereotypes. And particularly, she shows that Christianity has the power to overcome actual toxic behavior and reconciles the sexes. So again, click that I in the upper right-hand corner for a link to this book, and you'll find it below the video description.